What would you do to know the future? Maybe I should ask how far you've gone to know the future. Certainly one of the worst things about the pandemic has been not being able to plan ahead. I've been going through stories in which God's people are in trouble one way or another. We're picking up the story of Gideon again today. He is a hero of the faith. He's listed in Hebrews chapter 11 in the New Testament as one of the examples for us from the history of God's people. But I am going to say some things today that may surprise you a little bit about the nature of his character. He is an example for us, and we need to pay attention to the details of his story to find out how it applies to us. The story begins, as we discussed in an earlier message, with a traumatized man trying to prepare a bit of grain, hiding in a wine press to do it. Gideon had lost a couple of brothers to the enemy that had swarmed over his land. The Lord appears to Gideon in an angelic form and declares him to be a man of valor, a mighty warrior. He tells Gideon to lead Israel against their enemies. Gideon's first task is at home, tearing down the family shrine to Baal and Asherah, false gods whose worship was disgusting. In the morning, the villagers find out and come after him, but Gideon's dad, Joash, says Baal should be responsible for his own shrine and calls his son Gideon by a new name, Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend with him. Reading this week, I got to thinking it's almost like naming Gideon Anti-Baal. When God told Gideon that he was a man of valor, that became true even if it wasn't obvious. When Gideon tore down his family's altar, he was acting out or performing what God had already declared to be true about him. God spoke, and it was so. What happens next? We're in Judges chapter 6, and this is verse 33. Now, all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, so that they too went up to meet them. A couple of things in this passage. The Midianites are the occupiers, joined by the Amalekites. The Midianites are distant relatives, as are the Amalekites. Amalekites became a symbol of evil in Judaism, so that enemies of the Jews at later times could be called by that name, even if they were not part of the nation of Amalek. The Bible describes the Lord ordering Amalek wiped out. Interestingly enough, there are no ancient inscriptions found to the present day that mention Amalek. It's just in the Bible. Gideon calls his immediate clan to war, along with members of their tribe, Manasseh, 3 others, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. In the Old Testament, when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon a person, that is when war is coming down the tracks. That's what it says here. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. Now, I'll just make a side note here. If you're concerned about or turned off by divine violence in the Old Testament, I definitely hear you. In the description here, you'll find a short video that is an addendum concerning that. Not exhaustive, but just a few minutes addressing that topic, which is not part of this message. In Gideon's case, he blows a trumpet blast to summon a volunteer army. This is a ram's horn, not a brass trumpet, but they are played in a similar way, and certainly just as loud. And then there's this famous passage. Starting with verse 36, Gideon said to God, "If you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken." Sometimes you'll hear about people facing a dilemma or praying for the will of God and using an expression that comes from the story of Gideon, putting out a fleece. They're looking for a sign of some kind, maybe something God says, or an opportunity that opens up or not. That's their fleece. That makes it sound like Gideon was doing the right thing, or at least something acceptable. But I want to ask you, didn't God already give Gideon a sign? Rewind to earlier in the story, a verse we haven't read yet today. Back up to verse 17 of chapter 6. Gideon said to him, that's the angel, "If now I have found favor in your sight, show me a sign that it is you, the Lord, who speak with me. Gideon goes and prepares a meal, and when he places it before the divine messenger, it turns into something else. Verse 21 says, the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand, and touched the meat and unleavened bread, and fire sprang up from the rock, and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. So, when Gideon puts out his famous fleece, sheepskin, it's not a sign of faith, it's a sign of questioning or even maybe disbelief. Not only did God already give Gideon a sign, but he has been speaking in words to Gideon. First face to face, and then Gideon could hear the voice, perhaps in his mind. Imagine if you tell your kid to clean a room and she responds, if it's really you telling me to clean my room, make a red mark on this piece of paper. Gideon should get credit for this, and I think it's important for you and me today. When he has doubt or questions, he goes toward God. It's not wrong to have questions, to admit that you don't understand, as long as you're directing those thoughts and those possibilities towards God. Maybe that's why Gideon's mentioned in Hebrews. And God does humor his request. Chapter 6, verse 38, it was so. When Gideon arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he drained the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Of course, if you've ever left clothes out on the lawn or something overnight, you know this isn't the best of signs anyway. The clothes soak up the overnight dew right off the grass. This must have clicked in Gideon's mind because he makes the same request again in reverse, since that would be a more divine sign. Gideon said to God, do not let your anger burn against me that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground. Verse 40, God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and the dew was all on the ground. That really is a better trick, but Gideon was never supposed to need it. Has divination ever been a temptation for you? I mean, don't we all want to know what's going to happen next or what God wants from us? Throughout history, people have tried different ways of getting this information. Maybe the ones we are most familiar with are the ones forbidden in the Bible, necromancy, calling up the dead and asking them questions, together with what we know today as television psychics and spiritualists. Horoscopes. God's people are not to bow down to the starry hosts. Others are not as familiar to us. Others are not as familiar to us. Ancient people used to have professionals that would look at everything from clouds to sheep guts in order to divine the future or to find out what the will of the gods was supposed to be. It sounds weird, but human nature hasn't changed much. People want to know the unknown. You're less likely to use magic, maybe, but if you're like me, maybe you've listened to pundits trying to tell you what's going to happen in the political world or the election. How's their track record? Maybe you've seen that old picture of the newly re-elected President Truman holding up a newspaper that reported incorrectly that he'd been defeated. Dewey defeats Truman. You'd think that the press would have a little more humility, but as 2016 and events since have shown, the press has no shame at all. Even if you want to know what's going to happen next with the coronavirus, you can't get that information. Maybe it's already peaked, maybe not. How can you plan? Everybody has always wanted to know what's going to happen next, but nobody knows. Maybe God doesn't want us to know. Almost never in the Bible does God tell people future events exactly as they're going to happen. It's almost as if he thinks it better that we not know. What he does tell us is that he will be with us. And actually, that's what Gideon's asking for. He's asking for reassurance. He's nervous. He wants to know that God is with him so that he can be assured of a good outcome. God has called him a man of valor, and Gideon did manage to do the first job God gave him in the dark when nobody was looking. But he still wants more. God gives it to him. The whole fleece thing isn't wrong exactly, but God already had spoken to Gideon. Ideally, that should be enough for us. Isaiah 30, verse 21 says, your own ears will hear him. Right behind you, a voice will say, this is the way you should go, whether to the right or to the left. God does begin to speak again, and the shoe goes onto the other foot. God begins to test Gideon. The Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into their hands, for Israel would become boastful, saying, my own power has delivered me. By the way, we are in chapter 7 now. This is verse 3. Therefore, come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead. So 22,000 people returned, and 10,000 remained. Interesting relationship. Gideon requires repeated assurance that God will be with him, and God gives in. But then God is intent on not letting Gideon forget that he's the one who's making the victory happen. The next chapter indicates the enemy numbers around 135,000. Against that, 32,000 isn't that much, and now Gideon's forces are cut by 2/3. Lord, are you sure this is going to be enough? Verse 4 says, the Lord told Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. So he brought the people, and I'm skipping a little bit here, he brought the people down to the water, in verse 5. The Lord said to Gideon, you shall separate everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink. What did this look like? The original text is difficult to understand. The best explanations that I have seen is that the smaller group drank with one hand, kind of scooping it up, where the majority knelt down and cupped both hands together. None of us can really drink like a dog drinks. If you try it, see how many swallows you get before water goes up your nose. For centuries, commenters have tried to decide what sort of character trait is revealed by how these men drank. I grew up hearing that the ones who used one hand were alert and unexposed and watching for the enemy, ready to fight. Maybe that's true. But the issue in the story is not the character of Gideon's soldiers. It's about the power and choice of God. God is the one running the show. God is the one who's going to give the victory. Gideon is asked over and over again for God to repeat his promise to be with him. Frankly, we need to hear that ourselves over and over again. After answering Gideon with the signs he asked for, God commands that Gideon reduce his forces in such a way that no one will doubt God did the work of defeating the enemy. Verse 6, now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. All the rest of the people kneeled to drink water. The Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped, and will give you the Midianites into your hands. So let all the other people go, each man to his home. If you do the math, Gideon started out outnumbered 4-1. With only 300 men left, he's now outnumbered 450-1. And these guys that he has left are not special forces. These are men who have volunteered from the tribes. The key thing is that God is the one that's going to have to do the work. So what do you see in the story? First, God does not mind if we have doubts or questions, as long as we bring those towards him. There's a difference between saying, if there's a God and he wants me to believe in him, then he needs to prove it, and saying, God, show me the way. If you're going towards God, that's enough. God meets people where they are. Gideon was full of uncertainties, remember that the enemy had already killed members of his family. And God knew that when he called Gideon. I saw this in meme format recently. When God put a calling on your life, he already factored in your stupidity. Not you personally, but the general you. Substitute whatever character flaw you like. God calls you and me, and he meets us where we are. He's not surprised when we screw up, nor can our failures overcome his plans. It was God that was going to give Gideon the victory. With that said, I do believe that we're called to a higher maturity level than this character was able to go. God doesn't want to leave you and me to this level of faith where we are now, but he wants us to go higher up and higher in. If we listen, I believe that we'll hear God speaking to us, maybe not in an audible voice, but in a way that we can hear. God wants to provide guidance, and that happened to us recently. We were on our way home planning to tent camp in a particular park, but at the last minute decided to grab a motel room. After we'd got in the room, we could see on the horizon dark clouds, storms rushing through the mountains, rain, the threat of flash floods, all of which we avoided by being indoors. And to think I'd complained to the Lord earlier that it was raining when I was loading the car. I do believe that God speaks to his people even more clearly today than he did in the time of Gideon. To share a prayer that I've adapted from other sources, you might try saying to God, Lord, I need to know what you want me to do. I'm listening. Please speak to me through your word, the people near me, the other things that I read, and through things that happen in my life. That's enough of an invitation for God to work. If he seems slow to answer that one, do remember that we have enough marching orders to keep busy for now. One of the verses that describes those marching orders is Micah 6, verse 8. It says, He has showed you, O human being, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. We've all been affected by this plague, such as it is, but remember, as I've said many times, you have to be ready to go one way or another. We're all going to die someday, and none of us knows what that day is. Romans 14, verse 8 says, If we live for the Lord, or if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Our ultimate victory does not come in this world. The one thing that we have in common with Gideon is that God has guaranteed that he will be with us no matter what. Jesus, our Messiah, told us, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I've overcome the world.